Well, many thanks to Professor Fitzgerald for a really thought-provoking presentation, and he's kindly going to stay for another half hour and answer questions. So I'm going to go into the Q&A session immediately, and what I'm going to suggest is that each facilitator or member just asks one question so that we can deal with as many questioners as possible. And as usual, the mics are around. We'll start with table one.
How we doing, Dave? Table one. We seem to be with getting closer to the 2020 deadline, which everybody's admitting that we're not going to miss. The underlying trend from all the presentations seems to be we're starting to panic, as the Irish usually do. We get towards the deadline and so we might do something about it, seeing as we have to. Considering that this has been boiling over for a number of years, and with yourself being the chair of the Advisory Council, looking back over previous governments, and that the fact that it's basically going to be legislation will steamroll us into, because if, changing policies and energy, power stations, all that sort of stuff will have to be done top down. Could you suggest or think of a reason why there has been no proper impetus from any political party or government to do what is so blatantly necessary to do? What is it that has stopped the governments actually taking this decisive action that they keep on telling us is so necessary and so vital? Yet they're the people who have the ultimate decision to do it. So could you suggest that over the years, what is it that has led us to this stage now where we're starting to panic that nothing's being done?
I think that the problem, or one of the problems, was we've been through a financial crisis. And if you watch, say, Vincent Brown at 11 o'clock at night, or watch Prime Time, how often did climate change? It was, and it's not, don't blame the media, it is what was on our minds. It was survival. And so that if you talked about climate change and doing things that were going to be expensive, you weren't going to get much of a reception. And I think now we've come out of that, and now that the problems are even worse, I think that there is the fact that Cabinet for the first time sat down for a day to think about this issue. They haven't produced any decisions yet, is some progress. But I think that we really need to focus on 2030 now, that we have a chance of actually making a real difference by 2030 if we make decisions in the next year or so. But the point which you made that there's going to have to be investment. We don't change our cars that frequently. So it takes a long time to turn us around, and that's why it's urgent we start now. If we don't start now, we won't have moved to electric cars by 2030 because we'll have bought new fossil fuel-based cars. So similarly with electricity, we're going to have to make decisions on new generation. Why didn't we do it? I think there were too many distractions. The danger is there are too many distractions today, and that we won't do it now, even now.
Thank you very much. Table 5.
Nine had their hand up.
Oh, 9, sorry. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm the facilitator for table number 9. One of the citizens has a question. How has the overestimation in the strength of the recovery of the economy affected our ability to meet the targets?
I don't think if we hadn't recovered from the crisis, then we would have met the targets. It would be in a very expensive way, and a better way is change our policy. I think by 2013 it was clear that the economy was recovering and that we were unlikely to meet our targets. And by 2014 it was clear definitely we weren't going to meet our targets, but still we have delayed taking action.
Table 5.
Hi, my name is Mike at Table 5. I'm just wondering, would you be happy with the pace at which we're tackling climate change since 2015? And do you think this pace is sufficient for us to reach our 2030 targets?
answer is no, I'm not happy, and the council is not happy. That's our job, to be unhappy, to say could do better. The fact that we have not made decisions on new policies that are going to make a big impact in the last 2 years is disappointing.
How can you... Do you know of any vehicles that you could use, or techniques, or anything at all to... Well, I'm trying to find the right words here. Give the politicians a shake-up.
Well, it's up to the political system. Carbon tax, getting rid of the subsidy to peat, and arranging.
I'm sorry, I'm not explaining myself. I mean, from the point of view of growing a leadership somewhere.
Well, the fact that we're on the council, we're technical experts, we're not politicians. So I don't know how.
I understand that. It's difficult.
Thank you. Table 10.
Hello, John. Look, we cannot have a carbon tax on diesel becoming an election issue. We cannot allow this issue to separate urban and rural communities, which it may. We cannot in general have policies that have to be implemented to meet our 2020, 2030 and 2050 targets becoming election issues, which they may. What is the chance of all political parties coming together, or is there any chance of all political parties coming together to endorse a plan that needs to be implemented to meet our 2020, 2030 and 2050 targets?
Generally, over the last 25 years, the way major changes are made in policy is, first of all, they do appear in election manifestos. And I was told by a number of civil servants over the last few years that if it's not in an election manifesto, it won't go into the programme for government. It's got to be in one of the party's manifestos. And if it's not in the programme for government, it's very unlikely to happen in the course of a government. That's the way our government process works. So if you look back at the manifestos at the last election, climate change, with the exception of one party, was not a big issue. Another party had something on it. So I think if it is not an election issue, it is difficult to get prioritisation in. Doesn't mean that it can't happen, but it is difficult. So I think we need politicians to actually make it an election issue which they all agree on.
Yeah. Table 11.
Hi, Frank Sage here from Table 11. Given the fact that we're laggards in climate change, won't increased revenue from households by increasing carbon tax be used to buy carbon credits? Aren't we putting the cart before the horse by asking households to pay for political inaction on this over the last 20, 30 years, as you've said?
It's not a good use of the funds, probably, that it would be better to make the changes. And actually, there's a paper published by the Department of Finance, which nobody paid much attention to in 2013, which showed that introducing a carbon tax, some of which might have to be used to fund in the short run a buyout of our obligations, but that would drive a change in the longer term, which would be much better. And as I said earlier, buying out our obligations for 2020 doesn't make sense, we think, because it leaves you an even bigger climb in the future. And we need to start taking action now. So the carbon tax is one way, and it's only one tool to getting us to where we want to go. What the optimal strategy is in 2020 to deal with their failure to meet our obligations, we haven't looked at.
Yes. Table 14.
Thank you. In relation to putting climate change at the centre of policy making, we have seen very clearly what Denmark have done and what Scotland have done. They have established an agency in one case and a government department in another case, which is leading and directing and coordinating. We are now about to consider 14 questions in relation to the message which the General Assembly will put forward to government. Would we not be much better off if we put 3 very specific areas to government? One, that we want a department to be established for the purpose of developing, leading, and controlling. We want a special agency working underneath that department to implement the decisions which you spoke about, which are so essential. We already have a national mitigation plan which sets out a vision, but it has a desired end state, but how we get there, we're not sure. So we need specific actions, and that agency would then coordinate government departments, because what we heard of individual departments of agriculture doing what they are doing, usually from the bottom up more than from the top down. We have seen what transport are doing through the CEO of the NTA as to what they are doing, but who is coordinating all of that, and where is the joint planning? So I think I would suggest that would we be better off if we just gave 3 clear messages to government what we wanted, rather than a lot of different things which will happen anyway, actions, as a result of putting a proper body in place. And if we have a government department, we have leadership, we have direction, and hopefully we will have accountability.
Yeah. Well, in fairness, Professor Fitzgerald hasn't seen our final draft ballot paper. So, but I think just the points made by the Speaker, the 3 points, what would your observations on those be?
Well, we have moved responsibility for climate change from one department to another, which I think one of the problems with the National Mitigation Plan was that decision. It takes at least a year for a new government department to get up and running. So I think that the National Mitigation Plan would have been better if there hadn't been the disruption in the system. However, now that it's there, it's focused on this issue. So I'm not sure that a new government department would make a difference. It would certainly delay action for another year. In terms of special agency, I think you've hit on a problem, and you're aware of it, we're aware of it, a lack of coordination across government, and it's how you bring that about. And I gave the example of the government's planning framework for investment, where actually the minister rang Pascal, and Pascal himself sorted out that problem. So, but we had the experience of inviting in, say, the Department of Finance and then the Department of Public Expenditure, and on 1 or 2 items, one department said it's the other department that'll deal with it, and then the other department came in and said actually it's the first department that'll deal with it. There is a lack of coordination, but one of the problems in terms of a special agency is, if you think about it, the Minister for Climate Change is responsible for climate change, but the Minister who is responsible for taxation is the Minister for Finance. So we need a better way of coordination, and I think it is when departments talk to each other, they talk about other things but not climate change, and we need to be sure that they talk about climate change and coordinate. So I don't know what the right answer is, but you have hit on a problem of a lack of coordination to date across government departments. I don't have a simple solution. You may have.
Yes, table 6, yes.
I'm a citizen here at table number 6, and I have a question for you. What penalties are likely to be imposed for missing our 2020 deadlines in monetary terms?
I don't know is the answer. You could ask, the department might be able to answer, but I don't think it is clear. And I think the Minister has talked about that even if there were penalties, that they would probably be fed back to invest in tackling the problem of climate change. I'm much more concerned, I'm less concerned about the penalties than about getting us back on the right track. And it may well be that we have to pay because we don't meet our obligations. But the problem is that even if the sums were, I don't know if they were relatively limited in the first year, it then leaves you an even bigger problem the second year. So I think the urgency of taking action for me is because we have to tackle climate change rather than because the fear of penalties in the short run.
Table
2.
Table 2, yes, sorry.
Hi, John. I come from a county which we have a good reputation being good losers, County Mayo. And I live on the Wild Atlantic Way, which is beautiful. Our climate can change a few times in each day. Just saying that we come from an agricultural county, and our houses are very spread out, where I'm just wondering, we're not linked up to any gas or any alternatives, so would we have any incentive to put up a windmill in our house or farm, or is there any incentives that the government might think would work to change? I built a house going back a few years ago, and the carbon footprint in that house will last 50 years. So in saying that, the improvements that I would make to my own personal house, I'm just wondering, will change the carbon print a little bit, but not completely. So going forward, for anyone else that would be thinking about doing something similar, would there be any incentives?
All right. In terms of windmills, it depends on, first of all, on where you're living in Mayo. If you're living in Achill, I don't think windmills that look great in Achill, but there are areas in the middle of Mayo where there are windmills already where that isn't a problem. So not everywhere is suitable. In terms of, one of the issues is community involvement, that if your chosen technology was a windmill, they tend to come big, and it's not something you would put up in your house. It's something that a community might want to be involved in, providing a much wider benefits. In terms of solar panels, the way things are going, it may be that putting up solar panels on your house over the next decade may be a good use of resources. There are complexities here because the sun shines during the day, but that's okay if you work with candles at night, but none of us want to use candles. So finding a way of integrating solar on individual houses into a system where actually you still need the wires for nighttime will be complex. But there are experiments going on this, and I would have thought that by the end of the next decade, we will see a range of different technologies used, both locally and nationally, to produce renewable electricity. And if the price rises because of the carbon tax, it will become profitable for us to put solar panels on our houses. It will, and that's one of the things that we will make that choice because it is the simplest choice. There was a very interesting article in Financial Times yesterday on India, where 2 years ago it looked as if they really didn't want to be part of climate change, and they were planning to build huge numbers of coal-fired power stations, which really would negate all the benefits. Turns out they're not going ahead with a lot of these plans on coal-fired power stations because the cost of solar has come down to such an extent that they're installing huge quantities of solar electricity. So I'm really hopeful that the changes in technology will allow us to continue to have a reasonable lifestyle and to stop polluting the planet. But going back to Mayo, depends on where you live, what the technology would be that is suitable in the area.
We had a lot of discussion yesterday, particularly in the context of transport policy, about the different implications for the rural area and the urban area. Is the council looking at that, the advisory council considering that?
Yes. We haven't come up with an answer on this. Yeah. However, if you think about if we all have electric cars and if electricity is decarbonised, say that most of the cars being bought in Mayo by 2030 are electric cars, and if the electricity is produced in a sustainable manner, then if you drive around Mayo, you're not doing anything to harm the climate. Whereas people in rural areas have to drive much further. It raises the issue, and the Department of Finance are doing research on this. At the moment, the government gets $3 billion in revenue from diesel and petrol taxes. If you're using your electricity, there'll be no tax on the electricity because you're using your washing machine. You can't say, oh, the electrons going into your car are going to be charged. So it may well be, and the Dutch are looking at this, our counterparts, moving to a world where you pay for actually using the car if you're causing congestion. in which case there's not much congestion on the roads in Mayo. In the end, it could be that by 2030, people in Mayo would be paying less to use their car than they are today, providing it's an electric car and providing that the electricity is produced in a renewable fashion. So these are the kind of stories we need the government to lay out for us and say, what do we need to do to get to this position? And I think in terms of rural areas, the issue of transport, it's hard to see a public transport solution dealing with rural Mayo or rural Kerry, that cars are part of our lives. Can we have a normal lifestyle and not damage the environment? That's what we want to do. And it now looks as if we might be able to do that. But it's going to take a lot of investment and a lot of work to get there.
Any table? Table 3, yeah.
Good morning. I'm a citizen on table 3. Listening to your presentation and from some of the official presentations we've got, there seems to be a sense of amazement with official Ireland that people aren't buying into climate change and all that goes with it. But yet all you seem to suggest for a remedy to the problem is carbon tax and more tax and everything. And that's turning people off. Yesterday we were listening to Professor Andrew Kerr from Scotland, and their message over there to the people in Scotland is all the benefits that people are getting, and it'll make this easier for you, it'll make that easier for you, it'll save it. Why is our only official answer to all this tax, more tax, and nothing else?
There are benefits from tackling climate change today. For example, emissions from diesel in cities have major negative effects on health. So that if we move to electrify cars in urban areas, health will be significantly better. So if we insulate our homes so that we are using much less or no fossil fuels to keep ourselves warm, first of all, we may be warmer, and older people, their health may be better. There are all these side benefits, but I think that our responsibility is to be honest and say, yes, there will be benefits along the way, but the costs are likely to exceed the benefits. And the reason why we should spend that money is for future generations. So I have heard interesting debates among environmentalists saying, oh, we should emphasize all the benefits and hide the costs. Our responsibility as a council is to be honest with the people of Ireland and say, yes, there are going to be benefits, but on balance, the costs in the next 20 years are probably going to be higher than the benefits. But let's not lose sight of the benefits, because insulating your homes, as I said, not only I mentioned that my gas bills are 30% lower, but I'm also warmer and more comfortable. So yes, there are benefits to doing the right thing.
Table 11, is it? Yeah.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for Table 11, and one of the citizens has the following question. What specific steps could Ireland have taken in the past 10 to 20 years that would have prevented us being so far behind the targets today?
All right, well, you've heard enough on carbon tax. In terms of insulating homes, going back to the last decade, I was under the Northern Ireland Authority for Energy Regulation, and the social housing stock in Northern Ireland is managed for historical reasons by the Housing Executive. And they had a plan then to insulate the social housing stock as landlords. One of the problems here is that each local authority manages its own, and not that much has been done. That money has been spent on, say, offering me a grant to put in the boiler, which was going to cause me chaos. But maybe we should have targeted our resources at people who couldn't afford to pay and made a difference there. So there are a range of things which we should have done in the past. Also, in terms of investment, investing, sort of the last decade saw uncontrolled development with dwellings being spread all over the countryside in ways that people are going to have to commute long distances to work. If the planning system had delivered a much more concentrated development in the last decade, where people lived closer to where they worked, there would be emissions today would be very much lower. So there are a range of different measures that we could have taken and did not take. And there's research done which shows that if in the coming decade we develop new houses and where we live in the way we did in the last decade, this not only will we damage the environment, but this country will grind to a halt. That the commuting on the motorways into Dublin, into Cork, into Galway, already there's huge congestion problems now in Galway, that this is not a sustainable model. So that it's not just for climate change, it is to give us a sustainable lifestyle. We need to look at different ways of spatial planning. And that's one of the things that the new spatial strategy is out for consultation, and it's something which we, in our response to it, say you need to look at a different model of development which is sustainable.
Any other questions? Yes, table 1.
Sorry, from a carbon neutral point, what would be the effect of banning single-use plastics and replacing them with glass?
I'm not sure. The issue on, and there are wider environmental issues than just climate change in terms of our use of plastic. Some plastic actually can make a substantial benefit for, can I give an example? The Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and 3/4 of the food produced in the Soviet Union never got to the table. And in producing that food, there was huge damage done to the environment in the Soviet Union. And one of the reasons was they didn't package their food properly. And within 4 years or 5 years, the collapse of the Soviet Union, they actually started packaging the food so that most of the food got to the consumer, so that the environmental impact in the Soviet Union was substantially reduced. That is a good use of plastic, where it saves major waste. However, there are all these studies which show the accumulation of plastic in the sea and so on is doing huge damage. This is taking me beyond my comfort zone, and it's beyond the remit of the Climate Change Council once you move away from climate change per se. But it is a very real issue in terms of how we use the world's resources and the damage that we may do.
I'll take one more question from table 12.
Hello, Citizen on table 12. Just to follow on from the comments that were made on Citizen on table 3 in regards to increasing taxation. We seem to be emphasising that for get people to switch for the use of carbons or for petrol to make it more expensive. Why not make renewables cheaper? For example, if I want to buy an electric car, about 30% of the cost, or maybe even more of that, goes to the government in tax. Why not remove VRT and VAT from electric cars? And similarly, for example, solar panels. Why not remove that from solar panels and house insulation, so that there's a balance? If we want to pay extra tax, surely there should be benefits on the other side.
All right. Yes, there are incentives to buy electric cars. The tax burden is substantially less, and we saw where the tax changes made in, I think, 2009 made the people of Ireland suddenly adopt diesel cars because that looked like being a better solution. So yes, tax reliefs can make a difference. The problem is the government needs tax revenue. And in 1920, my grandaunt, she was one of 7 girls. They were badly off. They were all left a small legacy. And she spent her legacy going to Cambridge to study economics, and she kept wonderful notes. And in October 1922, she had a lecture from one of the best, most famous economists ever, a guy called Pigou. And in it, the notes say very clearly the polluter pays principle, that if you want to discourage pollution, then the polluter should pay. So it is part of the answer. It was part of the answer a century ago when my granddad studied economics, although Cambridge at the time didn't give degrees to women. She only got a certificate. They didn't start giving degrees till 1947, but that's a separate issue. So that is part of the answer. But also spending in sensible ways so it's not just about taxation, but if you remove the taxes from everything, then the government aren't going to have any money to invest in new technologies, to invest in insulating homes and so on. So we need balance in this regard.
Just to complete, can I just ask one question? Your recommendation that the government support reform of the EU ETS, what is the attitude of the other 26 remaining members? Do you know?
The Polish government would be totally opposed because they're coal mines, they use an awful lot of coal. So there is a distribution of, the new Dutch government formed 10 days ago in their programme for government to say even if the EU doesn't introduce a tax, they're going to do so. The United Kingdom were the first, and they did took this very seriously in 2011, where they introduced a tax to deal with the failure of the EU ETS. So there are a range of countries out there who are looking at options. The Portuguese government have just announced that they're going to do something on this, even if the EU doesn't. So there are countries in the EU who are taking much more dramatic action, and there are countries who are against. So the balance will play out, and I can't give you an answer on that.
Yeah, one can't foretell. It's a toss of a coin. Yeah, thank you very much. I would ask you all to show your appreciation. Would I sit here? Or would it be better to go up there?
It might be better to go up there.
All right, okay, because my head might be in the way here.
I might just mention that we're distributing it.
Yeah, and it's going to be up there.
It is, I know.
Yeah. Each question is going through it.
So if you maybe just want to announce for the purpose of those watching at home what's going on and why we're...
Oh yes, I will, of course, yeah. More work, and this time more very hard work, I'm afraid. I'm going to now explain the draft ballot paper, and the members are being furnished with a hard copy of the final draft. Has everybody got that at this stage? Very good. And the draft will be on the screen as I go along. Very good. Now, just by way of introduction, I'd say the following. Over the course of the last 2 weekends, the members of the Assembly have considered a range of issues in relation to our third topic, how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. Specifically, the sessions have focused on climate change in the context of energy, transport and agriculture, and it would be predominantly in these areas that the Assembly's recommendations will be based. Earlier this week, the members were provided with a draft ballot paper. Both that draft and the revised draft, which I will now present, incorporate extensive feedback from the members already. I think it is important that I describe the genesis of the document, the original draft ballot paper, and how that was formulated and revised how that was formulated, and the revised draft that I will present today. And the views of the members played a significant role in the formation of the draft. Now, at the conclusion of the first weekend on climate change, the members were asked, what would you like to see included in the ballot paper, and what would you like to be able to vote on? The feedback was incorporated in a very early version of the ballot paper, which was prepared by the Secretariat with the assistance of the Expert Advisory Group. This was presented to the steering group, which is made up of 12 members of the Assembly, on 19th October. We had a meeting here in Dublin on the 19th of October. The steering group provided further feedback at that session, and further extensive work was undertaken by the Secretariat with the assistance of the Expert Advisory Group to incorporate that feedback. The steering group met again on the 26th of October, again here in Dublin, to consider the ballot paper, and additional comments were received at that meeting. Once again, these were considered by the Expert Advisory Group. A draft ballot paper was then circulated to all members on 31st October, and comments were invited by all means. What I mean by that is in writing or verbally in advance of the weekend. The Secretariat has been engaging with the members on an ongoing basis in advance of today. I haven't done the sums on the number of hours that were spent by the Secretariat with the Expert Advisory Group and the Steering Group on the draft ballot paper, but it just, as happened on every occasion, we spent hours and hours and hours. Now, for the benefit of the members, the changes which have been made to that initial draft ballot paper are marked in red on the text. I'm sure you've noticed that already. And that the objective is to make it easier for you to see how your suggestions have been incorporated. All versions of this document will be made available on the website later today to allow the public to view the development of the ballot paper. And as usual, one of our key principles is transparency. In addition to these voted recommendations, later today, members of the Assembly will be invited to write down any other issues which they feel should be included as ancillary recommendations of the Assembly. Now, these ancillary recommendations won't actually be voted on, but the exercises will be considered by the Secretariat. They'll be examined in detail before the report is drawn up. And essentially, any emerging consensus on themes or issues will be included as ancillary recommendations in the final report. So in the case of the Eighth Amendment, when we analysed the reflective exercise and what was suggested as ancillary recommendations, we chose the 5 which appeared most frequently, and they were included in the report. So I don't know, it may not be 5, I don't know what will happen on this occasion, but that's the way we'll go about it. Now, just to make it clear, the reflective exercise and the outlining of the ancillary recommendations will be done on paper in writing after the voting has been concluded. And I think you've already been furnished with the document. I think we discussed it on Friday night. There's carbon, so it's duplicated, and you keep one copy of it. Now, before we go into private session to discuss the draft ballot paper, I want to provide a brief explanation of each of the questions, and I want to explain what the question is trying to get at what each of the options presented to the members mean, and in some cases why certain terminology has been used. A copy of each question will go up on the screen while I'm explaining each question, and that's for the benefit of those viewing online. Now, Following the roundtable discussions, which will take place when I complete the explanation, the relevant members of the expert advisory group, Margaret Desmond, Anya Ryle, Peter Thorne and Dermot Thorney will, together with myself and the Secretariat, we will be available to answer questions. So we'll have a questions and answer session at that stage. Time has been included on the agenda to allow any amendment agreed by the members to be included in the ballot paper. And then the results of the final ballot will form the basis of the recommendations to be made to the Houses of the Oireachtas. Now, the draft ballot paper structure, I just want to outline the structure. It's broken into 4 sections. First of all, Section A, and that's putting climate change considerations at the centre of policy. Section B deals with energy policy. Section C with transport policy. And Section D deals with agriculture and land use policy. And under each section, 1 or more draft questions are provided, and I'm going to explain each of those questions in turn. Now, the questions, and this is important, that it's important that I emphasise this, the questions have all been framed in the context of our terms of reference, which are to make recommendations on how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. So that has been the focus of the preparation of the draft ballot paper to ensure that what we propose is within the remit of the function given to us by the Oireachtas. Unlike some of the ballot papers at previous weekends, these questions are very much framed as statements on what the state should do to achieve a leadership role for Ireland, based on deliberations of the members over the course of the last 2 weekends. Now, I'm going to start with question 1. And now this question looks at putting climate change considerations in the centre of policy making. And as you see, it asks, and I quote, "To ensure climate change is at the centre of policy making in Ireland, a new or existing independent body should be resourced appropriately, operate in an open and transparent manner, and be given a broad range of new functions and powers in legislation to urgently address climate change. Such functions and powers should include, but not be limited to, those outlined below." And there are three powers outlined. 1, to examine any legislative proposals it considers relevant to its functions, and to report publicly its views on any implications in relation to climate change. And the relevant minister must respond publicly to the views expressed in a report prior to the progress of the particular legislative proposals. And the 2nd, to propose ambitious 5-year national and sectoral targets for emissions reductions to be implemented by the state with a regular review and reporting cycles. And then thirdly, to pursue the state in legal proceedings to ensure that the state lives up to its legal obligations relating to climate change. So that's the question. And just on the structure, which isn't in the paper before you, or what I read out, you're voting yes or no. And the 3 possible functions or powers are just listed separately beneath, but you're not voting on those. You're only voting on the main question. Now, this question looks at the establishment of a new body or the augmentation of the functions and powers of an existing body to hold the state in account in tackling climate change. It is not a choice between either establishing a new body or expanding the role of an existing body. The essence of the question is whether an independent body should be statutorily empowered to ensure climate change is at the centre of governed at the centre of government policy making. Now, the three possible functions which I have read out, which have been proposed, broadly encompass advisory, ambition setting, and compliance and enforcement roles. So advisory, ambition setting, and compliance and enforcement roles. In the feedback at the end of the first weekend and in the engagement with the members since then, it has been clear that the members want to be able to provide a mechanism for achieving leadership on the issue of climate change. This question seeks to articulate in broad terms the specific gaps which have been identified by the members of the Assembly in current leadership and proposes potential solutions to remedy these gaps. In preparing this draft question, I was keen to avoid getting too bogged down on the specifics of the functions and the powers the independent body could possess. We were instead aiming to provide a clear direction on what such a body could authoritatively do. This question was informed by the material presented to the Assembly from a number of the speakers we heard from over the course of the weekend. In terms of reporting on this question, you will observe from what's on the screen, you're asked to mark X in one box, either yes or no. A majority, and therefore the recommendation of the Assembly, will be determined by reference to the total votes cast in favour of yes and no, with the answer with the highest number of votes deemed to be the majority. Now, question 2. In the spirit of the terminology of this topic, as outlined in the resolution, how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change, question 2 looks to confer a leadership role on the state in terms of addressing climate change through both mitigation and adaptation measures. And the wording of the question is, and again I quote it, the state should take a leadership role in addressing climate change through mitigation options, including, for example, retrofitting public buildings, electrification of public vehicles, renewable generation on public buildings, and through adaptation measures, including, for example, increasing the resilience of public land and infrastructure. That's the question. You'll see it urges the state to both guard against and actively take measures to prevent the impacts of climate change. The question has been very much informed by the strong feedback from the members at the last weekend, particularly in the feedback session when the members discussed the national dialogue on climate change. Again, it is a referendum, but it is a referendum-style question, looking for a yes or no response. The majority and recommendation of the Assembly will be the option that receives the highest number of votes. Question 3. This question looks to establish a willingness or not on behalf of the members for greater financial contributions from the public to fund the transition to a low-carbon future by penalising carbon-intensive activities. And in the question asks the members to choose between two options. The first option, as you'll see there, is I would be willing to pay higher taxes on carbon-intensive activities. And the second option is I would not be willing to pay higher taxes on carbon-intensive activities. The proposition in either case, for or against, is framed with reference to 3 qualifications. These qualifications are included as they emerged from the discussions at the feedback from the members as particular issues they wish to see included on a question on taxation, and they were resonated in the Q&A a short time ago. The first qualification is as follows: any increase in revenue would be only spent on measures that directly aid the transition to a low carbon and climate resilient Ireland. including, for example, making solar panels more cheaply and easily available, retrofitting homes and businesses, flood defences, and developing infrastructure for electric vehicles. In other words, the money raised through these taxes would be separated from other resources of income for the Exchequer and directly invested in the transition to a low carbon and climate resilient Ireland. Now, the second qualification is that an increase in the taxation does not have to be paid by the poorest households. And we've taken as an example the 400,000 households who currently are in receipt of fuel allowance. And in including this qualification, the Assembly would be recommending that the government should take account of distributional impacts when imposing tax. In other words, it should seek to ensure that those already in poverty or at the risk of poverty are not disproportionately burdened. There may be other ways of doing that, but this is what we have suggested in the question. And then the third qualification is as follows. It is envisaged that these taxes would build year on year. In other words, the taxes would incrementally increase in much the same way as the cost of cigarettes does annually in the budget. The aim is to provide a signal to disincentivise carbon-intensive activities. Again, the members are asked to indicate their preference by answering yes or no. The majority and recommendation of the Assembly will be the answer that receives the highest number of votes. Again, that's the same as in the previous questions. And then we look at question 4. It looks to put an onus on the state to undertake an assessment of the vulnerability of critical infrastructure with a view to building resilience to climate change and extreme weather events and their consequences, like the damage that we witnessed in the last few weeks from Storm Ophelia. And the wording of the question, and again I'll quote it, the state should undertake a comprehensive assessment of the vulnerability of all critical infrastructure, including energy, transport, built environment, water and communications, with a view to building resilience to ongoing climate change and extreme weather events. The outcome of this assessment should be implemented, recognising the significant costs that the state would bear in the event of a failure of critical infrastructure. Spending on infrastructure should be prioritised to take account of this. Now, question 4 is also a referendum-style question with the option of yes or no. And sorry, no, it's question 4. Oh, sorry. It's another style, another referendum-style question, and you're expected to respond to option yes or no. And again, the majority and recommendation of the Assembly will be the option that receives the highest number of votes. Now, I will go on to question 5 now. This is the first question relating to energy policy, which we covered at the last weekend meeting. And the question is currently worded as follows. The state should enable, through legislation, the selling back into the grid of electricity from micro-generation by private citizens, for example, energy from solar panels or wind turbines on people's homes or land, at a price which is at least equivalent to the wholesale price. That's the question, the text of the question. Now, in considering this question, the members will recall the presentations we received at the last weekend, and in particular the information provided by Mary Donnelly and Brian Motherway, with respect to the reference to the resale price being at least equivalent to the wholesale price. This is designed to reflect the intention that, at a minimum, a private citizen who's selling should get the price that energy is being sold to the suppliers. I hope that's clear. I just cover it again. The idea is that the citizen who is selling back into the grid would get the same price that energy is being sold to suppliers. Now, voting on this question, again, it's a simple yes or no, and the recommendation is the same as the other questions. Going on to question 6, it currently reads as follows. The state should act to ensure the greatest possible levels of community ownership in all future renewable energy projects by encouraging communities to develop their own projects and requiring that developer-led projects make share offers to communities to encourage greater local involvement and ownership. And that question, I suppose, was prompted by the presentations received at the last weekend, and in particular the information provided by Mary Donnelly, Brian Motherway and Paul Kenny. And it is an issue that also featured prominently in the feedback from members. And just to go back, you'll notice that there are 2 elements in it. The first is to ensure community ownership insofar as possible, and then to encourage, or rather to, in relation to developer-led projects, that there should be share offers to communities involved. Again, it's a yes or no answer. Now, I just want to make some observations arising from the discussion the last weekend, before I move from this question. We have received some suggestions from members that the draft ballot paper should seek to express a recommendation that all future renewable energy projects should be publicly state-owned. We understand that this point has been raised in light of concerns about Ireland's energy security into the future and a desire to retain ownership of our renewable energy assets. Now, I just observe that this suggestion may bring us into complex areas of European Union law, including issues such as the state aid rules. I do, however, want to mention this at this stage so as not to lose sight of our discussions, but I also want to make it clear that I do not consider it appropriate that the Assembly should vote on matters where it has not received factual expert briefing and in this particular case, and which it has received advice as to the legal implications of such a proposal. So we haven't covered either the factual ramifications of such a proposal or, more importantly, the legal implications. Now, I'll move on to question 7. And this concerns peat extraction and bogs. And this, again, featured prominently in the feedback from the members in the reflective exercise completed at the end of the last weekend. It was also covered in the briefing from Laura Burke from the EPA, and to a lesser extent, some of the speakers yesterday. And the question is framed as follows, quote, the state should immediately end all subsidies for peat extraction and instead spend that money on peat bog restoration and retraining workers impacted and providing new employment opportunities for them. And again, it's a yes or no answer, and I think it's fairly clear, doesn't need any further explanation. Question 9, this would be question 8, yes, question 8, and this is the first question under in the section on transport policy, and the question relates to sustainable travel, and just to quote it, the number of bus lanes, cycling lanes and park and ride facilities should be greatly increased in the next 5 years, and much greater priority should be given to these modes over private car use. And that's the end of the quotation. The question is, to a certain extent, focused on solutions in an urban context. This is in recognition of the fact that a significant proportion of our transport emissions come from the urban areas, and therefore some solutions must focus on population centres, on these population centres. The remaining questions in this section make specific suggestions in respect of rural transport needs. And again, it's a yes and no answer, and I think the question itself is fairly clear. Moving on to question 9, and this concerns a transition to electric vehicles. And we heard both Anne Graham and Brian Caulfield yesterday about the perceived pitfalls of electric car ownership, including range anxiety. This question outlines a number of actions the state could take to encourage greater numbers to purchase electric vehicles and instilling the confidence in members of the public to do so. It also explicitly responds to the feedback from the floor about the special role cars play in transport in rural Ireland. And just to read the question, it states, the state should immediately take the following steps to support transition to electric vehicles: develop an expanded national network of charging points, introduce a range of additional incentives, particularly aimed at rural communities to encourage motorists towards electric vehicle ownership in the short term. Such measures should include, but not be limited to, targeted help to buy schemes, reductions in motor tax for electric vehicles, and lower freeway tolls. And measures should then be introduced to progressively disincentivise the purchase of new carbon-intensive vehicles, such as a year-on-year increase or year-on-year increases in taxes on petrol and diesel, motor tax, and purchase taxes for petrol and diesel vehicles. And again, I think it's fairly clear, its meaning is fairly clear, and again it's a yes or no answer. Question 10, this focuses on the public transport network. It suggests that the state should prioritise the expansion of public transport, particularly in rural areas, over the further development of road infrastructure, which continues to contribute to our car-based transport system. And as currently framed, it states, the state should prioritise the expansion of public transport options over new road infrastructure spending at a rate of 2:1 to facilitate the broader availability and uptake of public transport options with particular attention to rural areas. And in considering this question, members will recall the presentations received yesterday in relation to transport, and in particular the material presented by Anne Graham about the levels of investment in public and private transport currently. And again, it's a simple yes or no answer. Moving to question 11, which is the first question in section D and relates to agriculture and land use policy. And as framed, it states as follows: there should be a tax on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. There should be rewards for the farmer for land management that sequesters carbon. Any resulting revenue should be reinvested to support climate-friendly agricultural practices. And this question has been included following on from the presentation which the Assembly had yesterday from Alan Matthews, where he advocated putting incentives in place so that the agriculture sector makes its appropriate contribution, and that the agriculture sector would not be exempted from the disciplines that apply to all other sectors. And again, it's a simple yes or no answer. Now, question 12 focuses on food waste, and it's included arising from the presentation made yesterday by Isolde Ward from Food Cloud, and it reads as follows: with the objective of introducing appropriate measures to reduce food waste in the future, the state should introduce a standard form of mandatory measurement and reporting of food waste at every level of the food distribution and supply chain. And that is the question as now formulated. And yesterday we heard from Isolt about how such a measure would place Ireland in a leadership position in relation to tackling food waste. And again, it's a yes or no vote. And finally, question 13. It relates to land diversifications. And it was a point that was addressed in the presentations yesterday, and it currently reads, the state should review and revise supports for land use diversification with particular attention to supports for planting forests and encouraging organic farming. And I think that was resonated again in the discussion this morning and the Q&A. So that's my explanation of the draft ballot paper. And you'll now move into roundtable discussions, and we'll resume at 11:45 for feedback and questions. And the members of our expert advisory group will join us up here and assist in answering the questions. So we'll resume, as I say, at 11:45.